A couple of years ago, my best friend and I drove down to the States for a music festival. We had an absolute blast, but on the way back, one of our friends needed a ride home for school, so he hopped in with us. The three of us decided to push straight through in shifts, a brutal 24-hour drive. My turn came in the middle of the night, around 2 a.m. The sky was crystal clear, with a massive full moon lighting up everything like daylight. It was one of those perfect summer nights. But as I drove, I noticed the GPS had quietly taken us off the main highway onto a lonely back road. We dropped down into this enormous valley, wide open fields stretching out forever on both sides. Not a single house, car, or light anywhere. We hadn't seen any sign of human life for hours. Then, without warning, we lost everything. No GPS, no satellite radio, no cell service. Total blackout. I wasn't too worried though. The road was straightforward, and we just had to follow it for a while. About 20 minutes later, we approached an old bridge. That's when I saw it, a car parked on the side of the road. At first I thought someone was sleeping inside, but something felt off. All the windows were completely blacked out. Even with the bright moonlight, you couldn't see a single thing inside. As we got closer, I noticed it had no license plate either. We passed it slowly. Seconds later, its headlights snapped on behind us. The car pulled out and started following. Not just following, tailgating us aggressively in the middle of absolute nowhere. We couldn't see the driver or anyone inside. The blacked-out windows made it feel like a shadow chasing us. We tried to stay calm. Maybe the guy was lost and just needed to follow someone out of the valley. But the blacked-out windows and missing plate kept nagging at me. That's when the uneasy feeling hit. At first it was subtle, but it quickly grew into a full-body alarm screaming at me to get away from this car as fast as possible. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've never been the type to panic, but I've only ever felt this exact gut instinct a few times in my life, and every single time, it meant real danger. I tried brushing it off until I saw something lying in the middle of the road ahead, almost like it was timed. The car behind us suddenly backed off. My friends, one of whom had been sleeping, sat up, squinting through the windshield. As we got closer, my stomach dropped. It looked like a body lying right across the lanes. This wasn't a major road. It was a narrow, desolate back road with deep ditches on both sides and no shoulder. There was nowhere to swerve. No lights, no houses, no other cars, just us and the one tailgating us. I gripped the wheel and told my friends, I'm not stopping, no way. We were nearly on top of it when we finally saw what it really was, a scarecrow. Someone had laid it out perfectly across the road, like a body. I didn't slow down. Our big truck had a wide enough stance that we rolled right over it without even touching it, and kept going. The car behind us, which could have easily gone around, stayed right on our tail. I sped up. It sped up. I slowed down. It slowed down. It was playing with us. Finally, I floored it. After a couple minutes of this deadly game, the car suddenly slowed, made a U-turn, and disappeared back into the darkness. My passenger turned to me, pale-faced, and whispered, I swear I saw spikes sticking out of that thing. We drove in silence for another 30 minutes before the satellite and cell service finally came back. When we finally made it home around 5 a.m., we remembered something that made our blood run cold. There had been news reports about a few people who had gone missing, recently travelers driving back from the States who never made it home. To this day, the three of us are convinced we narrowly escaped something straight out of a horror movie. We did report it to the police and gave a full statement, but without an exact location, there wasn't much they could do. Still, we wanted it on record, just in case. Back in high school in North Dakota, my friends and I had a strange hobby. We'd research old murders that happened out in the county, then drive out at night to find the actual scenes and film ourselves exploring them. This was a couple years before the Blair Witch Project, so we thought we were pretty original. Mostly it was just an excuse to drink cheap beer and act like idiots. Eventually we ran out of murder sites. North Dakota doesn't exactly have a long list of them. So we got really good at spotting abandoned farmsteads, instead driving dirt roads, looking for old rutted paths, deliberate tree groves, or lonely mailbox posts sticking out of the grass. One night, we spotted a suspicious tree grove in the middle of nowhere and cut across the field toward it. Sure enough, there was an old house tucked inside, not ancient, but clearly empty. The doors had padlocks on them, but they were old and rusty. We knocked them off without much trouble and stepped inside. 6 of us, all with flashlights. The kitchen lit up easily, and the first thing we noticed was the dining table. It was fully set for a meal: plates, cups, silverware, everything perfectly in place. In all the abandoned houses we'd been in, we'd never seen that before, especially not unbroken and undisturbed. The fridge still had the rotten remains of what must have been a full stock of food. Cupboards were packed with canned goods and dry staples. Mail on the counter was dated early June 1978. In the living room, someone found an old TV guide with UFOs on the cover. Family photos still hung on the walls: mom, dad, brother, and sister, all frozen in 1970s fashion. Closets were full of clothes. Furniture was dusty, but otherwise fine. It didn't feel like the family had moved out. It felt like they had simply walked away one day and never come back. We headed upstairs and split into pairs to check the bedrooms. My group took the first room on the right, clearly a young boy's room. We'd barely stepped inside when the most blood-curdling scream echoed down the hallway from one of the other rooms. We all came running, shouting over each other. After a few chaotic seconds, the 2 guys who screamed caught their breath and just said, "You have to see this." I walked down the hall trying to act tough, but the second I stepped through the doorway, my stomach dropped. The room opened up to the left. On the right side sat a queen-sized bed. Propped up against the pillows, blanket pulled neatly up to its waist, hands resting on top, was a life-sized porcelain doll. Snow-white skin, jet-black hair, and cold, dead eyes. Its head was turned slightly toward the door, staring directly at whoever walked in. The flashlight beams made its eyes glint like it was alive, like it had been waiting there patiently for 20 years for someone to find it. We didn't stick around. We practically fell down the stairs and sprinted to the car. On the drive back, the real creep factor hit us. In a house where the family left everything behind: food in the fridge, clothes in the closets, photos on the walls, someone had taken the time to carefully position that doll in bed. Not packing, not grabbing essentials, but deliberately setting up that nightmare doll was one of the last things they did before disappearing. We tried researching the family name later, but found almost nothing. No car accident, no murder, no missing persons reports, nothing. The county had eventually seized the property for unpaid taxes, which explained the padlocks, but the trail went completely cold. To this day, I still think about that house, a perfect time capsule in the middle of the prairie, with one final disturbing touch left behind. A few years ago, I rented an apartment from a friend who had just bought and fully renovated the place. He couldn't find a buyer, so I moved in temporarily to help him out. It didn't take long to realize the woman next door was seriously disturbed. She looked closer to 60 than her actual 45. Every single night, she'd stay up blasting Christian radio shows and talking loudly to herself or to someone only she could see. After a few sleepless nights, I finally knocked on her door and politely asked her to keep it down. She cracked the door open just enough for me to catch a glimpse inside. Every wall was covered in crosses painted in different colors. The words Jesus and angels were scribbled everywhere in what looked like marker. All the windows were painted completely black, blocking out every trace of light. The place reeked of dampness, old carpet stains, dog shit, and cockroaches scurrying across the floor. I never saw a dog. She just stared at me with empty eyes, said nothing, and slammed the door. A few seconds later, the radio got even louder. The next night, my girlfriend was staying over. I woke up in the pitch dark to the feeling that someone was standing right beside our bed, staring down at us. At first, I thought I was half dreaming, but then the shadow spoke. It was her. She was standing inches away from us in complete silence, holding something in her hand. In a flat, eerie voice, she said, "You should lock your door at night," then turned and walked out of the apartment like it was nothing. The next morning, I heard strange noises under my bedroom window. I looked down and saw her standing there, speaking in tongues, rocking back and forth. In her hand was a plastic bag. Inside was her dead dog rotting in the summer heat. The smell of death drifted up to my window. I was officially terrified. I went upstairs and knocked on another tenant's door. The guy opened it, looking as shaken as I felt. He told me she had broken into his apartment one evening while he was watching TV with his kids. He walked into the kitchen for a snack and found her standing behind the couch, silently staring at him, holding a power drill. That's when I knew exactly what she'd been holding the night she stood over our bed. I called the police. They already knew her well, a violent schizophrenic who had stopped taking her medication. The problem was she owned her apartment, so they couldn't just enter. They could only take her if they caught her outside. For the next 2 days, I barely slept, listening for any sound of her leaving. At 2 a.m. on the second night, I heard her door open. She was heading across the street to the 7-Eleven for cigarettes. I called the cops immediately. They showed up in under 2 minutes, 3 patrol cars, and a special van. They grabbed her before she even reached the store, restrained her, and loaded her into the van. In less than a minute, she was gone. It was like she had never existed. I never saw her again. But to this day, I still wake up sometimes with the memory of her standing over me. A few years ago, my friend and I decided to explore an old abandoned complex of houses that looked like they dated back to the 1930s. The main house was 3 stories tall and so heavily overgrown that a full-grown tree was blocking the front door. Our only way in was through the old cellar doors. We headed down using just our phone flashlights. Surprisingly, it wasn't that creepy at first, even though the ceilings were barely 5 feet high and we had to hunch the whole way. We made it up to the second floor, nothing. No furniture, no trash, completely empty. Same thing on the third floor. That's when we both started getting weird vibes. The entire place was spotless. No dust, no dirt, no cobwebs. Just immaculate. For an abandoned house, that felt way more unsettling than if it had been trashed. We noticed a piece of plywood screwed tightly over what looked like a doorway. Curiosity got the better of us, so we pried it off. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading up to the attic. When we got up there, we found a single wooden chair placed right in front of the only window, perfectly positioned as if someone had been sitting there for a long time, staring outside. My friend sat down in it and realized it was aimed directly across the highway at an old roller rink. That one hit different. I was already on edge, but that sent chills down my spine. The property had a few other buildings, so we kept exploring. The second large building looked almost identical from the outside. We went in through the front door this time and immediately noticed conveyor belts running through the main room with rusty metal hooks hanging from chains above them. The place was once again eerily clean, except for the rust slowly forming on those hooks. Upstairs, we found shelves filled with old red leather books, all titled The Book of Knowledge. That stuck with me because of another creepy abandoned house I'd explored before. Then we climbed up into that building's attic. Another single chair. This one was facing the top of the stairs we had just come up, like someone wanted to know if anyone was approaching. And surrounding the chair in a loose circle were dozens of fox skulls. By this point, we were properly freaked out. We figured maybe it had once been a chicken farm and the farmer kept the skulls from foxes he'd killed, but that didn't make it any less disturbing. We still had the basement to check. Down there, we found something completely out of place. The floor was covered in children's toys, Tonka trucks, outdoor toys, stuff like that. Odd, but not as terrifying as the rest. After that, we moved on to the 5 or 6 old campers scattered around the property. Every single one was wrecked, tipped on their sides, upside down or leaning against trees. We climbed into the largest one, maybe 25 feet long. The entire inside was packed with newspapers. My friend picked one up and checked the date, 2013. This was last year. That was our fuck this moment. We noped out immediately. We're actually planning to go back this weekend, so I might have more stories soon. When I was 15, my family moved to a small town just north of Salt Lake City, Utah. It was far enough west that the wind often carried the heavy, rotten smell of the Great Salt Lake. I started school halfway through sophomore year, which felt like being a freshman all over again, in a place where everyone already knew each other. I was awkward, out of place, and lonely until I met Sarah. We started dating right before summer break, and for a few months that summer, things felt almost normal. Sarah came from a big Mormon family. I quickly learned that devout Mormon families in Utah often had 7, 8, or even more kids. Sarah was one of 7 sisters, ranging from 6 to 18 years old. I only met her mom once she was pregnant again, and I never actually spoke to her dad. The whole family felt overwhelming, so I mostly avoided going inside their house. One thing that always struck me as odd was how Sarah refused to let me pick her up at the door. She had a strict curfew, so I'd park down the street and wait. There was a small gully lined with trees right beside their house. I offered to jump it a few times to meet her faster, but she always got nervous and insisted we walk around. I figured she just didn't want to get her shoes dirty or risk waking her parents. This went on for months. I'd wait down the road while she snuck out the back, walked around the gully, and met me on the street. I was always careful not to step too far onto their lawn. One rainy night, I decided to surprise her by meeting her at the back door so she wouldn't have to walk alone in the dark. To avoid passing her parents' window, I cut through the trees toward the gully. The rain had swollen the water, making it faster and deeper than usual, but I thought I could clear the jump. I was wrong. My feet hit the muddy bank on the other side and sank instantly. I slipped backward hard into the cold water. Panicking, I grabbed at anything nearby and caught what felt like a storm drain pipe. It broke loose in my hand as the current pulled me down. The water was only a couple feet deep, so I managed to stand up, still clutching the black garbage bag I'd accidentally ripped free. I dropped it and tried climbing out, but my hands kept sinking into more slick black bags buried in the mud. On the third or fourth attempt, I tore one open by accident. Inside was a tiny skull, yellowed, bloated skin stretched over fragile white bone, a baby's skull. The smell hit me like a punch decay mixed with wet earth. I screamed and scrambled backward, kicking myself up against a tree, heart hammering in my chest. That's when I saw Sarah standing at the edge of the gully. She was crying. She must have heard me shout and come running. In that moment, I realized she had probably always known. I never saw her again after that night. A few days later, all the sisters were pulled out of school. The local news reported that their father had decided he didn't want any more children. For years, he had been quietly burying each newborn daughter in the gully behind the house. They recovered 5 tiny bodies, all girls. To this day, I still wonder if he was just waiting for a son. My parents bought a cabin up in the mountains of Virginia. My mom and sister used to go there on weekends, and after a while, my mom started telling us these strange stories. They'd wake up in the morning to find the side door wide open. It didn't matter if it was summer or winter. They changed the locks, but it kept happening. The weirdest part? The door never opened when the cabin was empty. It only happened when someone was actually staying there. I always laughed it off, thinking they'd just forgotten to close it properly, or the latch was faulty. Being young and cocky, I decided to test it myself one winter night. The cabin had no heat except for a small wood stove and electricity. I drove my Jeep out after work and arrived after dark. Light snow had started falling, and it was already 13 degrees. I was freezing and already regretting my decision. I quickly built a big fire and stoked it until the cabin started warming up. Before heading to bed, I made a show of closing the side door, locking it and tugging on it hard several times to prove it was secure. I climbed into bed with an extra quilt and fell asleep fast. Then came the nightmare. In the dream, I woke up to an ice-cold cabin. I got out of bed to restart the fire, and the second I stepped into the main room, I saw the side door standing wide open. When I turned, a tall lizard-like demon with glowing red eyes was staring straight at me. I jolted awake, heart pounding. Great, I thought. I'm out here alone in the middle of nowhere and my brain's screwing with me. That's when I noticed how cold the cabin actually was. I climbed out of bed and walked toward the main room to check the fire. The second I entered, I froze. The side door was wide open. Snow had blown across the floor. My nightmare was playing out in real life. Panic hit me hard. I let out a yell and frantically slapped at the light switch. The lights came on. Nothing was there. No demon. No footprints in the snow. Just an open door and cold air pouring in. In my engineering brain, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the heat from the stove caused the wood to shift and pop the door open. I still didn't go back to the cabin for a long time after that. A few years later, someone built a house directly across the street. After the new family moved in, I went over to introduce myself. We were chatting when I asked how they liked the area. The dad said they loved it, but the kids were having a hard time adjusting to country living. They're a bit spooked, he said with a smile. They keep saying a monster comes into their room at night. I must have gone pale as a ghost. He didn't seem to notice. During her second year at university, my friend's housemate lived in a shared house with 3 other students. When Easter break came around, everyone headed home to their parents. She was the first one back after the holiday. The morning after she returned, she noticed some of her things had been moved around her bedroom. She brushed it off, assuming she'd done it herself the night before and forgotten. But the next morning, even more items had been rearranged. Her TV, chair, and other belongings were in different places. An uneasy feeling started creeping in. She confronted her housemates, telling them to stop messing with her stuff because it wasn't funny. They all swore they hadn't touched anything. By the third morning, the situation had escalated. More things were moved, and now everyone in the house was getting genuinely worried. On the fourth night, she woke up in the middle of the night. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw a figure sitting completely still at her desk. She panicked, bolted out of the room, locked the door behind her, and called the police. When the police arrived and opened the door, there was a young man, early 20s, sitting calmly at the desk like he belonged there. They arrested him on the spot. A couple days later, the full story came out. The man was mentally handicapped and had lived in that exact house with his mother his entire life. After his mother passed away a year earlier, he was moved into a nearby care home. He had run away several weeks before and returned to his old home. For 2.5 weeks, he had been secretly living in the house, sleeping under the girl's bed every night and quietly coming out while she slept to rearrange her room exactly how it used to be when it was his bedroom. She moved out the very next day and never spent another night there. When I was about 13 or 14, strange things started happening in our house. I'd get home from school on the bus before my mom picked up my little brother, so I was usually alone for 30 to 45 minutes. I'd sit in the living room doing homework when I started hearing footsteps moving around upstairs and down the hallway. But whenever I looked, no one was there. With the way our split-level house was laid out, I should have been able to see anyone on the stairs. Still, I never saw a soul. A few months later, the footsteps turned into something worse. Almost every other week, around 6:30 in the morning while I was getting ready for school, I'd see him. I'd be walking down the upstairs hallway toward the bathroom and catch a glimpse of a man downstairs. He'd walk from the living room into the kitchen, calm as anything. Average height, early 30s, light brownish blonde hair, wearing the same green plaid shirt and khaki pants every single time. The first time I saw him, I crept downstairs, terrified, only to find the kitchen completely empty. After that, I learned to just ignore him and keep walking. I was convinced I was losing my mind. Before WebMD even existed, I used the internet to diagnose myself with schizophrenia. I was so scared of being institutionalized that I never told a single person what I was seeing and hearing. 2 years later, my family moved 2 states away. The moment we settled into the new house, the man in the plaid shirt vanished. I never saw or heard anything unusual again. Fast forward another 2 years, I was doing college tours and interviews, and my mom would drive me on the longer trips. One day on a long car ride, we started talking about ghosts and the paranormal. She told me she genuinely believed in that stuff. I figured it was finally safe to share my experience. I casually said, "Hey Mom, this is gonna sound crazy, but back in our old house I saw some really weird stuff." She turned to me instantly, eyes wide with shock, and asked, "Did you see the man in the green plaid shirt?" I froze. I had never described him to anyone, not once. Yet my mom had just perfectly described the exact same man I had seen for 2 straight years. That was one of the creepiest moments of my life. I was working as a paramedic when we got dispatched to what sounded like a routine assault call in a rough neighborhood around 10 p.m. When we pulled up, we saw a man standing behind a row of parked cars in front of his house, yelling in a strange, high-pitched, warbly voice. Police were already on scene trying to calm him down. At first, we assumed he was the victim, but as we wheeled the gurney around the cars, the real horror came into view. A man was slouched in the gutter, leaning lifelessly against a Mini Cooper. For a split second, maybe 2 seconds, I thought he was alive and staring straight at me. Then I realized his eyes were empty. He was gone. He was shirtless, and his chest and abdomen had been absolutely shredded by multiple stab wounds. These weren't clean punctures. They were brutal, violent tears, one of the worst things I'd ever seen. The guy on the curb was his roommate. He was crying hysterically, asking us if his friend was going to be okay. We jumped into CPR, loaded him up, and rushed him to the hospital, even though we all knew it was hopeless. A short while later, 2 cops showed up at the hospital to handle some paperwork. That's when they dropped the bomb on us. The initial story was that the victim had gone outside for a smoke and was found stabbed. But after we left, officers noticed a clear trail of blood leading from inside the house all the way to the curb. When they confronted the roommate about it, he suddenly bolted inside and barricaded himself in the house. While we had been working on the victim, a full SWAT team was actually surrounding the house trying to get him out. The man who had just brutally murdered our patient had been standing right behind me the entire time, crying and playing the role of the concerned roommate.